Thank you. I think I should leave at this hour. God love you, as my mother would say. It's great to be back, and it's good to be at this conference. I've been coming since the 80s when I was a senator, and I came back, as has been pointed out, as vice president as well. Tonight I'm here in a new role. I'm no longer in government. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and I run a Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. And I've always found this to be one of the most productive, interesting, and important fora where world leaders get together and we actually talk about serious topics, and sometimes we actually do something about them. And it's nice to be back each year. I came here, as is pointed out, in 2009 at the request of President Obama to lay out the first major statement our administration was to make on American and our administration's foreign policy. Hello, Mr. Secretary. Many folks at the time and since then have referred to it as the Russian reset. But my remarks in 2009 were much more than attempting to reset our relationship with Russia. We laid out in uncompromising terms, uncompromising principles about how the world should be organized and how relationships between nations should be maintained. At the time, I said, specifically with regard to our relationships with Russia, I said, we will not recognize any nation having spheres of influence. It will remain our view that sovereign states have the right to make their own decisions and to choose their own alliances. Nations represented in this room built the post-World War II liberal international order. And we did it, and our fathers and mothers did it, to limit the capacity of any nation, large or small, to abuse power on the global stage. That was the essence of what we were attempting to do. And to me, that goal remains as consequential as it ever was. And I think we have to remind our publics as well how consequential it is to their lives and to their well-being. Because today, the Kremlin and President Putin are doing everything in their power to deconstruct that order, in my opinion, to weaken NATO, to undermine Western democracies, and to break apart this transatlantic partnership. I don't think it is designed to rebuild the Soviet Union. It is one man's opinion. I think it is to deconstruct the liberal world order. And the reason why I think he and the Kremlin are doing this, in my humble opinion, is naked self-preservation, not of Russia, but of their naked self-interest. It's easier for the Kremlin to push the fault lines of Western society than to address the gaping fractures in their own country and governance. The fragility of their multi-ethnic state, the stranglehold of oil and gas on their economy, their network of partnerships held together solely through coercion, and the fact that their population is aging and shrinking. By almost any objective measure, this is a country and a nation in serious decline, by any historical measure. To cover these challenges, I believe the Putin regime, both at home and abroad, seeks to project an aura of invincibility, one that masks how shallow the roots of public support are at home, particularly among younger, urban, and educated Russians. There is nothing more than weakness masquerading as strength, as I see it at this moment coming out of the Kremlin. The Kremlin is threatened by the spread of democratic ideals wherever they are, but particularly on their borders. because any alternative that can attract support jeopardizes the wealth, power, and privilege of those oligarchs in charge. So we understand all too clearly the why motivating Putin's actions and the Kremlin's actions, but we also know, I believe, the how. We have consistently observed Russia's abuse of its power by using its hard military power to violate the sovereignty of Georgia and Ukraine, manipulating energy supplies to influence and coerce their neighbors throughout Europe, adapting and honing information warfare to meddle in democracies all around the world, not just in Europe and the United States. While seeing it as elections approach this year, we'll see more of it in Mexico and throughout Latin America. As I speak, it's occurring. And fourthly, by weaponizing corruption around the globe as a way of co-opting foreign leaders, undermining democracies from the inside out. Each of these acts on its own is outrageous, in my view, but taken together, they constitute a dagger aimed at the heart of that liberal world order. It's purposeful, it's insidious, and unless we recognize the seriousness of their assault on our basic democracy and respond accordingly, I believe we imperil the very future we have so long pursued in this transatlantic partnership. So tonight, I'd like to offer a few and emphasize brief recommendations for action that we should seek to implement together, in my view. First, I think we have to double down on our alliances that are the very foundation of this liberal world order. We should be working closely across NATO and the EU countries to counter threats, both military and non-military. And yes, that means allies should invest and strengthen their own defenses and deterrence capabilities, but we should also repeatedly acknowledge Article 5 means something to every single solitary member of NATO. And it means taking care not to undermine or damage that solidarity that keeps us lashed together through every storm in the past, and I believe we'll do it in the future. Article 5 commitment should be sacrosanct. The trust and credibility represented by that commitment, an attack on one is an attack on all, is at the very core of this alliance. And I believe any one of the members of the United States Congress, and many are here tonight and tomorrow, with whom I traveled here, would tell you the same thing, irrespective of party. How else can we effectively work together to build our resilience against this Russian influence? Well, if Europe and the United States don't continue to stand together as partners of first resort, fighting for our shared values, be reassured that the rest of the world will start to change their strategic calculations about where they stand. Second point I'd like to make, we all have to work harder to reduce the vulnerabilities that exist and to strengthen resilience against Russian meddling in our own countries. Some of that means improving our cyber maintenance, securing computer networks, running our critical infrastructures, partnering with private media and technology companies to learn how to address foreign disinformation campaigns. So it's going to require hard reforms to our political systems and our financial sectors, including in the United States. There's a desperate need in my country for campaign finance reform for a simple reason. All the changes that have taken place in the last 4 years have limited access and vision into who is contributing what. Increased the prospects exponentially of being able to influence outcomes as a consequence of contributions. Quite frankly, gone a long way to eliminate, in many cases, transparency. It matters who is contributing to what advertisements, what campaign initiatives in each of our countries. Our publics have a right to know. Because of the changes we made in our the way we finance our elections, there's too much money and far too little transparency, giving Russia and, quite frankly, other foreign powers opportunities to meddle in unseen ways with real consequence. I thought I knew a lot about this area, but I must tell you, in the aftermath of the election, and I'm not making a reference to whether anything having to do with President Trump, in the aftermath of this last election, to find out the thousands of paid ads on social media, the thousands of ads we were unaware of on Facebook, the thousands of attempts to meddle and influence American public opinion without having any idea what the source was until recently. Time will not permit, you'll all be asleep by the time the panel gets up if I go into it, but there are indictments today in the United States of America on Russian entities for what we have known for some time has been going on in terms of trying to impact on our electoral process. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, it's irrelevant to me who they were trying to influence, vote for or against. They have no damn right. No right whatsoever. It's our sovereign right to be able to conduct our elections unfettered, period. And what we can't do is what is tending to be said now by those who don't want to take a harder look. How many times have you heard, which I never thought I'd hear, I've been doing this a long time, well, there's nothing to be done. Nothing to be done. Well, ladies and gentlemen, at a time which I will not take, there's a great deal to be done. A great deal that can be done. And the most basic thing of all, in my view, is to expose in plain, simple language, understandable and factual, to all our constituents exactly what is happening. Exactly what is happening. Not in mumbo-jumbo, not in foreign policy speak, in simple, plain language. What is going on? Because the majority of our people, we have not attempted to educate as to what is actually going on. Exposing just how pernicious the Kremlin's activities are and attempting to undermine our sovereignty will go a long way to awakening the people in each of our countries. And that is half the battle. The ability to have malign influence evaporates when people are aware where the influence and the rationale behind it is. It's half the battle. And I must say, I don't think any of us are doing, particularly the United States, is doing a particularly good job in making that clear to our publics. Because disinformation campaigns are only effective when people don't see them. When they understand that some outside party is trying to manipulate them, they are much less susceptible, and the arguments being made seldom go very far at all. This leads me to my third point. It's critical that we tell the whole story, the true story. We have to document the breadth and scope of Putin's full actions so that our population grasps the gravity of what's occurring. I recently wrote an article for Foreign Affairs, and in that I point out the starting point for this in the United States would be the creation of an independent, nonpartisan commission to examine Russia's assault on American democracy, establish a common understanding of the scope and complexity of the threat, and to identify the tools required to combat it. But I've subsequently come to the conclusion, after being importuned by a number of European leaders, that we shouldn't do this alone. Because it's not just America. This affects us all. We should consider standing up an international commission to examine Russia's malign activities across the board. And in the past few weeks, as I said, I've had conversations with senior European elected and unelected leaders from across the political spectrum in Europe. And I've seen real interest in considering setting up such a commission. Because we all have to do better at coordinating information to root out Russian subversion, to identify corrupt networks, to prosecute money laundering and financial crimes. Authorities and the private sector should be doing more together to counteract this meddling as well. And once we know everything the Kremlin was up to, we have to impose real consequences for their aggressive behavior, whether it's violating national sovereignty or interfering with our elections. And that's the fourth step. For the Kremlin, it's simple logic. What they're doing is to foment division and distrust in Western democracies, and it's working. And they're keeping it going until we begin to change the cost-benefit ratio for them. We have to stand up, united, and impose costs on Russia for its violations of international law and other countries' sovereignties, those it has committed and those that it is planning to continue. We can't let up on sanctions that the United States and the EU levied on Russia in response to the invasion of Ukraine. It's not just pressuring Moscow to resolve the conflict in real terms, although that is of paramount importance. It's a critical signal to the Kremlin that we mean what we say, that we're not going to stand idly by and just issue an invitation for them to do more. Putin has to know the cost of this behavior in the long run will certainly outweigh the benefit it perceives now. And the fifth and final point I'd like to make is that even as we stand firm in our defense of democracy, we can't quit talking to Russia or trying to work with them on critical issues like strategic stability, because the stakes are much too high. Even at the height of the Cold War, we found ways to work together. We need crisis communication channel with Russia as much as we ever did. We can't risk misunderstandings leading to war, not between two nuclear superpowers with military assets deployed in close proximity to each other. We have to tone down this new foolish rhetoric that I haven't heard since I was a 29-year-old United States Senator about the feasibility of the use of certain nuclear weapons. It is so irresponsibly dangerous. We need to avoid loose talk and the destabilizing arms race. And in those narrow circumstances where our interests do converge, we need to find a way to work together, as we did in our administration. Through everything, in my view, we have to continue to reach out to the Russian people. We have to reach out to the Russian people and stand with Russia's civil society. Because at the end of the day, this is not a conflict between Russia and the West. It is a conflict between a Russian kleptocracy and the Russian people. That's the real conflict. And we need to make clear that distinction every chance that we get. And that means being more active on the information front with the truth, not disinformation. Not to promote propaganda, but tell the Russian people the truth and where we stand. And the truth is, this is all about a small group in the Kremlin willing to do whatever it takes to protect themselves and keep their illegal grip on power and money, which is power. The United States has not always been the perfect guardian of this new order after World War II. When we fail to live up to our own values, we do nothing but provide fodder for the forces of illiberalism. Our administration was certainly not perfect. We made missteps. But over 8 years, President Obama and I consistently worked to ensure that the United States would lead not merely by the example of their power, but by the power of our example. This is a defining challenge, I believe, for the foreign policies of all our countries moving forward. And it's one I've spoken frequently about in my home country. For if we fail to make the case of a world led by a common set of values, we risk slipping back into the traps of prior generations, succumbing to raw nationalism that pits us against them rather than building from a shared narrative of freedom and democracy, which we've done since the end of World War II. Falling prey to phony populism that dissolves that invisible moral fabric that holds up all civilized societies, the customs and norms that make free societies work and which hold together our democracies. We already know where that leads. All we have to do is read not-so-distant histories. But I can say without exaggeration, in spite of the challenge we face, if we stay together, I have never been more optimistic about our collective future than any time in my entire life. I believe in the resilience of this transatlantic alliance and community and the democratic values that uphold it. I believe we have an unrivaled capacity to address the challenges before us and lead the world to a future that we all want to see, a future of limitless possibilities and opportunities for every single child on this planet. The things that are about to happen in the next 2 to 10 years are mind-blowing. They can have such a positive impact on the rest of the world. Someone sitting in my place 5 years from now speaking here, we will have gone a long way to curing cancer. We'll be flying subsonically before the next decade is out at 22,000 miles an hour around the globe. We'll be making changes that are absolutely mind-blowing. Before we get to the 2030, we have the capacity to have a planet that is basically its energy basically generated by renewable energy. There's so many things within our capacity. We have the best educated populations, the most resilient population. We have so much, not only offer our own citizens, but the rest of the world. As I said, I think we have an unrivaled capacity. And I'm still hopeful that the time will come, and will not come in the near future, but eventually, the people of Russia will look west and not in that deep black hole they've been staring into for the last part of 150 years or longer. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we already know how to do this, but I do believe we have to start to speak up. We have to hear our voices. They must be louder. They must be louder. Talking about our shared values, our common purpose that first drove us to envision and build this world order over 7 decades ago, creating the most resilient alliances in the history of mankind, generating more prosperity in a 70-year period than any period exceeding 250 years before this. So folks, it's time for us to get up, pick our heads up, remember who the hell we are. Start to take back the dialogue that's going on around the world. Like I said, I never thought I'd live to see this naked nationalism be given legitimacy in so many parts of the world, and this phony populism designed just to clear the space to allow the strongest to struggle for power and dominate. So folks, I'm sorry to keep you so late, but it's getting a little late for us not to speak up in unison. Thank you all very much.